Transboundary environmental problems are those that cross or spill over from one country to another. Classic examples include long-range transboundary air pollution, global trade of hazardous waste, and the pollution of lakes and rivers. Some argue that transboundary issues might be easier to identify and address when compared to global commons issues, yet their international nature makes them uniquely difficult to solve. For instance, when it comes to transboundary water pollution, it might be hard to identify all point and non-point sources of pollution and who gets most affected by them in the long term. Lakes and other pooled water systems contain more than 90% of the liquid freshwater on the surface of our planet and provide the widest range of life-supporting ecosystem goods and services. Pollution of these major lakes can easily lead to water scarcity, as the freshwater becomes unavailable for human consumption. Water pollution can also affect crop irrigation and overall health of nearby ecosystems. To address this and many more issues, 3,600 water-related treaties have been created around the world, yet, as Pestel and Wolf argue, while cooperation over water has been the norm, it has not been the rule. Overexploitation and pollution of lakes, rivers, and aquifers can jeopardize these ecosystems and have dire consequences for the reliability and sustainability of water supplies, which can cause international tension if those impacts are felt more keenly on a particular side of the border. In the case of Lake Champlain, we see that increased pollution has generated a wide variety of problems affecting the local economy, the health of thousands of humans and other animal and plant species, as well as the availability of fresh water for the years to come. More than 145,000 people rely on Lake Champlain as their source of safe and reliable drinking water. While the waters are often safe for fishing and swimming, pathogens and excess nutrients continue to threaten the health of the lake. What makes the situation of Lake Champlain particularly pertinent is that besides the multiple sources of pollution and the involvement of the agricultural sector, it is an international problem involving Canada and multiple First Nations. 56% of the basin is in Vermont, 37% is in New York, and 7% is in the province of Quebec. When it comes to US-Canada relations, we can find several state and provincial agencies in New York, Quebec, and Vermont working on protecting the basin's resources. Additionally, the Champlain-Adirondack region, in which Lake Champlain is located, is a UNESCO-designated biosphere reserve, meaning the international community has a vested interest in protecting its extensive temperate coniferous and deciduous forests, as well as a large number of lakes, bogs, and freshwater wetlands. This UNESCO designation places several actors, both state and federal, at the decision-making table when it comes to the region. Nevertheless, when it comes to state relations with First Nation communities, we can identify significant challenges, one of them being how states understand the concept of borders and land. As pointed out by Professor Guntram Herb from the Geography Department at Middlebury College, the experiential, holistic, and spiritual nature of Native conceptions of land were difficult to represent in maps. In line with their oral traditions, verbal descriptions were more effective to define limits of control for Native spaces. Similarly, Professor Robin Kimmer states that when Indigenous communities talk about land, they don't tend to do so in terms of property ownership, but as a responsibility. She points out how land, rivers, and lakes are conceived as sacred and inspirited as a part of a collective identity and history. Another challenge to dealing with the pollution and the governance of Lake Champlain comes from the level of inclusion, meaning who gets to sit at the table and decide the policies and programs affecting the future of the lake. Through interviews with Eugene Rich, chief of the Missisquoi Abenaki Nation, we learned about their interest in joining roundtables with different state and non-state actors to share their perspectives on sustainability and why the lake is sacred to them and their families.
I think there are 4 Abenaki tribes in Vermont, and I think every one of them would welcome at least having 1 or 2 seats at that table.
An example of how Lake Champlain water issues can play out can be found in a 2007 case study of the Burlington Intervale, one of the largest composting operations in Vermont. At the center of the controversy is Intervale Compost Products, a 16-acre not-for-profit composting operation aimed at promoting local food security. In operation since the mid-90s, The facility processes items such as manure, decomposed leaves, and food waste from suppliers such as Ben & Jerry's, cheese factories, and the University of Vermont. Over time, the waste is collected into piles and then converted into soil-enriching compost. However, before the rapid growth of the Intervale compost products, some had already deemed this land to be archaeologically significant. A study of the lower Winooski River Valley ranked the Intervale as the most sensitive archaeological site in an area stretching as far as Westford, Starksboro, and Bolton. Furthermore, there is also the risk of organic pollutants produced by the composting process contaminating the Winooski River, a tributary of Lake Champlain which flows through the valley. There are claims that more toxic wastes such as lead, carcinogens, and arsenic are also being leached away into the river. It should be noted that Intervale Compost Products is situated on a floodplain, which compounds the risk of contamination. This base is worth preserving because it has served as a breadbasket for the Abenaki families for years. This large-scale operation begs the question of whether or not the Intervale's composting operation is damaging the burial ground and the quality of water surrounding the environment. Judy Dow, a member of the Vermont Commission on Native American Affairs, insists yes. The problem is, this is not agriculture, this is a business, she insists. Because it is a business, they have a totally different set of rules to follow. She is referring to the Act 250 regulations, which are designated to help farmers manage pollution without experiencing unnecessary bureaucratic oversight. And Intervale Compost Products didn't follow those rules. So here we have a conflict between two non-state actors, a green non-profit organization touted for its environmental stewardship, and a native community. This struggle between two non-state actors is rather common, and so is the result: little change in behavior. Despite the growing consensus that Indigenous peoples' knowledge systems, rights, and solutions should be meaningfully included in global environmental governance, substantive improvements in practice remain limited. And the space for introducing them and contesting norms, ideas, and meanings remains constrained. This incident represents a microcosm of the democratic deficit that exists in governance, as Indigenous peoples continue to push for recognition and justice. Their traditional knowledge and beliefs are often positioned as inferior to scientific knowledge. As a result, they are steadily losing control over their resources and related traditional knowledge. This raises questions of justice. In global environmental governance, justice can be said to exist when 1. Participation in political decision-making around environmental policy is meaningful, 2. Risks and benefits are equitably distributed, and 3. Diverse identities, ways of knowing, and experiences are recognized. As such, it is hard to argue that justice exists when a compost facility sits perched atop a culturally significant burial ground on a floodplain. This case study is an indication that the inclusion of Native communities in the deliberation and environmental decision-making is not sufficient. In all portrayals of this case, there is little evidence that private and state actors in global environmental governance fully recognize the value of Indigenous heritage and overall say in governing the land. The rights, knowledge, and solutions of Indigenous peoples are critical to the formulation of effective and equitable responses to environmental threats. Going forward, governance would be improved by considering what a system built on a procedural and recognitional justice for Indigenous peoples would look like. The case study also illustrates how critical theories are increasingly recognized as important and useful tools for explaining and predicting international environmental governance. Critical theories recognize the impact of non-rational factors and non-state actors on international environmental governance. Race is an important factor in global environmental governance because it has shaped borders, economies, and landscapes of the modern developed world, and therefore informs how actors interact. Individuals are not merely rational beings, but rather ideas, values, norms, and justice matter. Therefore, critical race theorists argue that international environmental relations cannot be understood without understanding power imbalances and racism. In this case of Intervale Compost Products, the exclusion of the voices of Indigenous people in favor of a business situated on culturally significant land demonstrates a form of environmental racism. While Intervale Compost Products has been lauded by environmentalists as a green nonprofit, Governance that allows Intervale Compost Products to continue its operations on this significant site cannot be considered effective because it does not address and emancipate from these imbalances of power and inclusion. Judy Dow's work to change the status of Intervale Compost Products from a farm to a business, therefore bringing it under Act 250 regulations, also indicates the role that non-state actors can play in shaping governance, which further demonstrates how critical theories may have more explanatory power than traditional IR theories. Ultimately, the nature of the Lake Champlain case study as a transboundary region, a UNESCO-designated biosphere reserve, creates various barriers to effective international environmental governance, which must be improved through not only participation justice, but also a deeper form of recognition justice.